All right, so good afternoon, everyone. Happy Valentine's Day, and welcome to our 2 o'clock briefing, Blockchain, a tool to share and accelerate science. We have 3 excellent speakers today. They are Lav Barshney, Assistant Professor of Electrical and Computer Engineering at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, Kweku Apoku Ajuman, a Research Fellow at the Center for Effective Global Action in the Department of Economics at University of California, Berkeley, and Krishna Radhakonda, an IBM Fellow and Chief Technology Officer at Blockchain Solutions. Without further ado, we'll get started.
Thanks, Megan. So I thought I'd just briefly mention what is blockchain. And there's actually no formal definition. It was originally developed in applications in cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin and Ethereum. But it's now become kind of a general technology for distributed ledgers, kind of a way to build trust in a variety of settings. And in many ways, trust has progressed now from kind of tribal trust, for example, in ancient Greece, where mathematicians used to exchange letters with each other, to institutional trust for the last 400 or 500 years, where professional societies and journals have been kind of the gatekeepers of things, to now perhaps using distributed trust. So it allows scaling of science perhaps without centralization. And there's a lot of technologies that are being developed, so authenticated data feeds to allow physical data to go into the blockchain in a cryptographically secure way, distributed storage and fast throughput consensus algorithms that will allow blockchains to be much, much more energy efficient and storage efficient and communication efficient than Bitcoin, let's say. And I think for us, the exciting areas are to address kind of the emerging crises in science, things like the replication crisis, p-hacking, a variety of these things, which I think Kweku will get into, but also kind of providing a platform for incentives for scientists to share things, kind of a platform for sharing early stage research before it's embedded in a full manuscript, providing a way to share conjectures, and also actually, for example, doing higher throughput replication. My colleague James Evans, who was supposed to be here but missed his flight from Chicago, or his flight was canceled from Chicago, he just did a very nice study where they looked at drug-gene interaction studies, and they did a high throughput replication of 51,000 such studies. And what they found was that centralized scientific communities, their claims are less likely to replicate, even if they're widely agreed upon. On the other hand, decentralized research communities involving independent teams and using more diverse methodologies generate much more robust and replicable results. The feeling is that these kind of distributed small teams are perhaps even more powerful in science than one might imagine. Right, so I think I'll stop there.
Hello, everyone. What I want to do is to talk briefly about the potential of blockchain to help make meta-analysis research more transparent. And I'm focusing on economics and the social sciences. So what a meta-analysis does is basically aggregate individual studies on a topic to see if the conclusions hold across them, not just within them. And a meta-analysis is supposed to be the last word in science. Hello? Okay. So a meta-analysis is supposed to be the last word in science, but in practice, it almost never is. And there are reasons for this. So the main reason is because, when you're putting together different studies to see if the analysis holds across them, you make so many subjective decisions along the way that some meta-analyses can contradict others. So it's not clear which one is right. And the example which I focus on is whether video games cause violence. So today is the anniversary of the Parkland shooting, for example. And whenever these tragedies happen, there are often discussions on whether video games are at play. However, there are meta-analyses that show that video games cause violence, and there are others that show that it doesn't. So it's not really clear who is right and who's wrong. And in 2011, the Supreme Court struck down a ruling from California which would allow people to sell violent video games to children. And as you can imagine, it's very controversial. It's not clear who was right or wrong. So how blockchain can help us with trusted timestamping? What trusted timestamping means is just an indelible record of decisions people make while doing a meta-analysis, so that we can know where two of them differ. We can pinpoint where exactly somebody took a left and someone took a right, essentially. The idea is that when people do literature reviews and pick studies and decide how they're going to analyze different papers, we should know everything they did and not just what they choose to tell us at the end. And this is where trusted timestamping can be pretty useful, because it gives an indelible record of the decisions people make without them being able to go back and change them. And I should note that I don't think at this stage it would make sense to force scientists to do research in this way. But I think that we can make a credible case that this improves significantly on the status quo. You know, that when researchers are doing a study on video games and violence, we should be able to know the hypotheses they want to test before they test them, know how they pivot when the data shows them different things that they didn't expect, you know, and to see how much weight we should put into conclusions that they repose. In many cases, it's not really the case that one is right and one is wrong. Sometimes they're just answering different questions, and they only look similar in a superficial way. But by knowing all the decisions that they have made along the way, we can have a credible sense on what to focus on and what to believe, essentially. So this is one way that blockchain can help meta-analysis to be much more transparent than is currently the case. Another way is going beyond small-scale experiments that psychologists tend to do. So rather than recruiting college students to see if exposure to a video game makes them use inappropriate language and things like that, that we can actually look at actual video game releases and look at violent activity in those activities where people play them a lot, and collect a lot of that data at scale and see how real-life outcomes change. But all of this is going to take time to get to a point where people can actually rely on these systems. But as far as the status quo is concerned, scientists face incentives like everybody else. They have to apply for funding, they have to publish papers, and it's not really the case that all conclusions are equally weighted. If you have a flashy finding, it may sell better than saying you didn't find anything. So there are certain pressures which doing research more transparently can definitely help as far as giving the public a closer view of what social scientists find. So I think I'll stop there. Yeah.
Okay. So, I mean, as Love already mentioned, right, I think, blockchain has started with Bitcoin, but it has really evolved into something, quite different now, right? It's a general purpose vehicle for trusted multi-party communication. If you think about it in that context, really, I think the different variants of blockchain, they carry, I think, 4 fundamental properties. One is finality, right, which means that anything that you write on blockchain, you cannot erase. The second one is non-repeatability, which means that if Joe put this data on blockchain, then you can cryptographically prove that it's really Joe and not Adam who put that data on blockchain. The third one is around privacy, right? So when Bitcoin started, I think, it was meant to be an open ledger. But when people have communications between each other, some of them, they want it to be private, right, and share it on certain conditions. So privacy is a key feature that many of the newer variants of blockchain already have built in. And finally, the fourth one is that up to now, what I've described is more like a data sharing mechanism, but the notion of smart contracts brings an ability to interpret the data. Is this data a mortgage document? Is this data a scientific paper, right? So the policies and governance about how you interpret the data can be encoded into the smart contracts. So if you think about these 4 key properties of blockchain, I think, that's really, I think, what we think has the potential to change, how scientific discourse can evolve into the future. The fundamental hypothesis that we have is that things are not working out all that well, right? So over the last 100 years, the template of a scientific paper has not changed, right? I think you have an abstract, you have a data gathering exercise, you have an analysis and a coherent formulation of some hypothesis which you test, right, using your data, and then you publish the results. That has not changed. I mean, if you look at, for example, Einstein's paper from early 1900s on gravity, gravitational lensing, it looks and feels exactly like a paper that's currently written, right? So what does this mean? But has the world stood still? No. I think every year, right, the number of papers increases by 3 to 4%. Every 10 to 15 years, the number of papers is doubling, right? So the quality starts to decrease over time, right? So what can blockchain bring here is really, I think, an ability to, in some sense, I think, if you think about Jacques Derrida and deconstruction, it can deconstruct the academic paper into the different piece parts and enable different parties, right, to kind of do the independent parts. Like, for example, one party may be very good at doing data gathering, but nowadays there is no incentive to share his data with others because the person who does the analysis typically has the emphasis, right? He's the one who gets the credit. So with blockchain, I think, all of the different participants, the data gathering, the analysis, as well as the people who do curation and citation, right? They all get, a credit and, for doing, their part in creating the next, maybe new discovery, right? And that really, I think, if you think about it, I think how do we evaluate scientific papers today is through citations, right? Hey, how many citations do you have? But citations is the last thing that a person who is writing the paper thinks about, right? I mean, he puts it in, but it's not really the core to his paper. But if we can make it a separate activity that somebody else does, right? And all of these guys can collaborate on different piece parts of creating the paper. I think the value that they can generate and I think the emphasis that they can bring to that paper, right, and the trust that they can bring to the results is going to be much more, right? That really is, I think, a fundamental hypothesis that I would like to bring up tomorrow. And I'll give you one concrete example of how things are already happening, right? So you may have heard in the press that IBM is partnering with, all the major retailers, right, like Walmart, Kroger, Carrefour in Europe, and several others, as well as suppliers to kind of build like a food traceability ecosystem. This was initially, I think, was around product recall, right? We hear about lettuce and the issues that we have with leafy greens. So Walmart is targeting all their leafy green suppliers to put the data on blockchain so that when a recall happens, the contamination event could be easily identified. There is a fundamentally transformative stuff which is happening here. These organizations were never sharing data before. This is the first time that the data is coming together. Once the data comes together, we start working with, I think, academic partners at MIT, at Columbia, at Illinois. They start seeing, new things that they can do with the data. So blockchain really separates out the data gathering part of it, which the corporations can do, versus the analysis part of it, which the academics can do, and get them together, right? So one example is food wastage, right? About 30 to 40% of food is already, spoiled by the time it gets to you, right, to the end consumer. Depending on which type of food it is, it can vary from, as I said, between 20 to 40% is kind of the numbers that the industry quotes, right? What we saw is that this is because organizations don't really know what the next guy in the supply chain is going to do with the food. Now, if there is global availability of the data, I think through simulation, what we were able to prove on this data set is that about 25% of that food wastage can be cut down. This is just because you know that the next guy is not ready to accept the stuff. So you don't send it to him. So very simple things, right? Now, because you have global view of the entire data set about how the supply chain is working, you can take better actions to improve the situation, right? So blockchain is not just, transformative in the sense of, hey, it enables different parties to come together and work collaboratively. It also, I think, starts coming up with, new data sets and ideas that we are not even thinking about right now because people just don't want to share it because of competitive reasons and other reasons. Okay. So we have several other examples that we'll take a look at tomorrow in the symposium, but hopefully this gives you an idea of, where we're starting to see blockchain, going into.
Great, thank you so much. And so now we can take questions from the audience. If you have a question, please raise your hand. We'll bring a mic to you, and please state your name and affiliation before a question. First question's up here in the front row, thanks to our mic runner.
Hi, thank you. My name is Sid Perkins. I'm a freelance writer. I know very little about blockchain, and all of that I got in the last 45 minutes. So forgive me if this is a really stupid question. Some of the things that you talked about in terms of distributed databases and error verification and all these sorts of things relate to maybe some of the big projects that people are doing with big data. Lots of distributed data from astronomy telescopes, or lots of distributed data from various organizations who are doing brain initiatives and biological genomics and those sorts of things. Can you tell me, how applicable and how useful blockchain would be to people doing that sort of thing? And I presume that there's bigger payoff for bigger projects and than there is for, effort involved in using it for smaller projects. Can you explore a couple of those things?
Sure. Yeah, I can start. Yeah, I think blockchain is useful not just for big science, but also for small science. I think it's useful in all settings. To focus on big science, as you were discussing, the Sloan Sky Survey or the Materials Genome Initiative, or all these, the Human Cell Atlas. So if you think of these kinds of things, there's kind of an interesting thing that the data is incredibly huge. And one of the difficulties is for people to kind of do kind of trusted computation on that data. And often the computations themselves might take a month to run on a computer, let's say. And so one of the interesting things one can do with blockchain is actually do intermediate kind of fixed points of the computation. So you can everyone can now verify whether the computation is correct, even though it's being carried out on a distributed network of computational machines. So I think that's one area where blockchain is quite powerful. And then coming back to kind of the small science setting, so even if you're doing an experiment in a lab with 100 human subjects, like a lot of these psychology studies, there is now this kind of replication crisis. This reproducibility is very difficult, and a lot of claims have not been replicated. So if one were able to kind of pre-register, that would help with a lot of these problems. And if you pre-register on a blockchain, then there's no going back. It's completely immutable, and then it's transparent, so it's clear what happened.
What do you mean on pre-registering?
So there's a growing interest in the so-called pre-registration, where you set out the experimental procedure and the analysis techniques in advance before you do any experiments or any analysis. And that is statistically a better approach, because if you do, for example, making hypotheses after you collect data, that has some deleterious effects on the statistical analysis. Likewise, this idea of so-called p-hacking, looking at very large experiments and trying to find the statistically significant finding and not pre-registering what it is that you were looking for in the first place. Or increasing sample sizes till you get a statistically significant effect rather than fixing the sample size in advance. So a lot of these kind of poor practices of scientific practice are often reduced or eliminated by pre-registration. And the other aspect of this is also by putting the analysis, say, code and data on a blockchain, it also helps with reproducibility. These days, people claim that a lot of experiments are reproducible, but it's not the code itself. It's not clear which version of the code was used, which parameters were used in the analysis, and so on. And so if you do all of this in a blockchain, then the very specifics of the experiment and of the analysis are clear. So the so-called whole tail of the experiment is captured in the blockchain. So I think in both settings, whether it's small scale or these crazy large things, the national labs or the whoever does, I think in both settings there's very strong utility.
Question behind you, Johan? Yeah.
Benny Mols, a freelance science journalist from the Netherlands. One of the problems with using the blockchain in cryptocurrencies is that it's very inefficient. You need a lot of energy. What about this problem occurring in sharing data in science? Is there a similar problem, or are there fundamental differences?
Maybe I can take that, right? I think with Bitcoin and Ethereum and some of these cryptocurrencies, because they want anonymous participants to participate, right? So there is no notion of identity. The type of algorithms that they need to use, right, has to have what they call the proof of work, which is where all these Bitcoin miners, et cetera, spend a lot of energy in order to even commit one transaction onto the Bitcoin network, right? So what's happening is, I think with the newer version of the protocols, I think because the identity of the participants is known, right? And in fact, people who publish scientific literature, they want their identity to be known. They want to be associated with that particular discovery, for example. So what that means is that the protocol that you can use in order to actually run the blockchain becomes much simpler. You can achieve, for example, with Bitcoin, I think 10 to 20 transactions per second even that is tough. Whereas with blockchains that you can use when identity is known, you can go very easily up to, let's say, 3,000, 4,000 transactions per second. And you don't need to do proof of work. So all that heavy-duty mining that you're doing all goes away, right? So there are much more efficient protocols you can use, just because the participants have declared their identity.
Just add one small thing. Currently, blockchains require every participant to store a complete copy of the ledger. There's also ways of not doing that. So if one has kind of a whole data center of data at Brookhaven National Lab, you don't have to have a copy of that every single node in the network. There's distributed storage codes that allow you to partition the information and only store a piece of it. And that still has the same cryptographic guarantees of immutability and all that. So whether it's energy efficiency or latency or throughput that Krishna was mentioning, or even storage or other things, there's new ways of doing things that are much more efficient than in cryptocurrencies.
Question here? Yeah.
Robin Williams from ABC, that's Australia Broadcasting Corporation. I was fascinated by your example with food. Now, I wonder, even though it's not directly to do with how science is done, if we can do a thought experiment. Where I come from, apartment blocks do not tend to have solar roofs. And the problem is that all the different apartments are in fact very different. You've got some people, just on their own, and you've got others with lots of people and using lots of energy, and you've got some people who are growing marijuana and having vast amounts of energy being used, and all of them are different. And so getting a coherent kind of sharing of the cost means that hardly anyone in apartment blocks puts solar on top. This, we're told, could be solved using blockchain. Do you agree?
Definitely, I think, there are efforts towards that direction, right? Like, for example, China, there are multiple companies which are actually doing what they call carbon credit trading, right? So as you know, I know carbon credits are given by the government, and, inefficient industries basically, can buy these carbon credits from others because they use more energy, and therefore, their net output of greenhouse gases is higher. So the carbon credit trading is already happening, right? But it's more, I think, I think they are focusing more on the process rather than the actual trading of the energy credits themselves, right? The process itself is cumbersome, right? You need to get a government approval and things like this. So that, even that, you could, speed up using blockchain, because the communication and, the exchange of credits between different parties can happen in a more efficient manner. But you are onto a good point, right? I think you are talking about, a couple of different things. One is, how do you know, who is using what, right? So without, for example, maybe you don't want to be known as the guy who uses, let's say, the most energy, but at the same time, you should be kind of, you should bear the responsibility of using that energy, right? So this is where I think, things like ZKP, as they call it, right? The zero knowledge proofs are coming up. So another example from a different field, let's say that you are applying for a handicapped parking spot. You have one of the, let's say, 20 disabilities which enables you to get that. But your doctor certified that, let's say, that you have Parkinson's disease, therefore you should be able to get one. Maybe you don't want to share that with everyone, right? In that case, maybe with zero knowledge proofs, what you can potentially do is that data the doctor can register against you, only you know, but you can create a proof after that saying that, look, you are one of the 20 conditions that that are eligible for handicap parking, and show that to the inspector. So that's equivalent to showing, before you had to show him exactly, what you had, but you can hide some of that. So I think with the evolving technologies within blockchain, definitely I think, you can go down more granular and enable, this type of sharing economy. Yeah.
Maybe while we wait for the next question, Krishna, in your example with Walmart, you mentioned, these corporations are sharing and they've never shared before. I'm wondering, how is a similar kind of sharing, a new kind of sharing that maybe hadn't happened before in science, going to affect scientific discourse? And do you think some disciplines would be reticent and not want to do it, even though it's on blockchain and secure?
Right. I think, there are many people who see these things as competitive advantage, right? By keeping that data, to themselves, right? They see some advantage coming out of it. And it's not just corporations, by the way, right? Even individuals, right? I mean, you collected some very interesting type of data which shows, let's say, some anomalies, and you don't want to share it with anyone because you think that, look, I may lose credit. Hey, this other guy can basically go there and claim credit, right? This is where I think blockchain can potentially come to the rescue, in the sense that, yes, I mean, you can still get credit, but at the same time, you don't need to hold the data in order to get the credit, right? And what we see happening within the scientific community is that, especially I think these days with, more data sharing, et cetera, that they are willing to actually, participate and kind of, do this in a more collaborative manner, right? So rather than say that, look, I have the data, I have to do all of the steps in the scientific process in order to get credit. So the notion that you can get credit for doing what used to be seen as, maybe not as important activities, I think, I think even the people doing that, I think now have an incentive to share their data rather than hoard it.
Yeah,
so,
and
yeah.
it's also worth adding, it's not just data, but also things like analysis code. So I do some work through the Human Cell Atlas myself, and there has been kind of a growing community that's been catalyzed by not just the sharing of data early before manuscripts are written, but also sharing of code and analysis pipelines. And for my own research, I mean, having access to the code and data analysis pipelines of others has really helped us move the field forward more quickly. So, and of course, it's clear where everything came from, because it's not on blockchain yet, but if it were on blockchain, it's very clear to trace back where everything came from. The code, the data, the conjectures, the hypotheses, the ideas, everything, it's clear where everything came from, and one can allocate credit backwards. Even if the currency of science still remains the paper, you can kind of disaggregate it backwards and give everyone a piece of that credit.
I should also point out that a lot of the blockchain things we're talking about are building on existing solutions that already exist. So in the US, for example, if people are doing pharmaceutical trials to see if a drug can affect a disease, you're supposed to pre-register your plan with the FDA and the equivalent in the UK, before you run any experiments. The advantage which the blockchain brings to this is that it's a lot more transparent than what you currently have. So you can send a pre-analysis plan to the authorities before you do your experiment, but it's not really clear that you did the experiment afterwards. There have been cases where people thought that something was pre-registered, but it was only written up after they had results. So this is providing another level of transparency that we didn't have before. And part of the hesitation towards adopting these methods has come from, the concern that, well, I can pre-register my analysis, but what if I think of something new that I didn't think of before? If I do that analysis, you're going to say that it's not pre-registered, so we don't believe it. Well, the good thing about trusted timestamping is that since we have a record of everything you've done, we can also pre-register new ideas as they come to you, not just what you thought of before you saw the data. So it's really a win-win for scientists and for the authorities as well, that they don't have to spend so much effort reevaluating someone's proposal. They can actually, put a lot more weight in whatever they find. And it also ties the scientists' hands to p-hacking, which is just, you can make a data set say almost anything with enough time and effort. But with so many papers that come out every year, who's going to go and check all of them? So it's better if we do it right the first time. And this is something where the blockchain can actually help significantly.
Maybe it's worth also adding the Kweku's comment. It's not just regulatory authorities who have interests of these kinds, but also funding agencies. So funding agencies often have a desire, they have values, they want to support some kind of research. And if one can if one can develop kind of smart contracts for the scientific research that's carried out based on certain funding sources, I think there can be a greater expression of these values. So I think that there's also that aspect which is kind of interesting.
Yep. Question here?
Thank you. Clive Cookson from the FT. Is it, if blockchain is introduced, does that increase or decrease the amount of administrative effort, the amount of time that people in studies have to spend? Is it a quick and simple process, or does it actually tie you up in more bureaucratic effort?
I can comment a little bit, but then I'll let the other panelists also comment. I think one of the nice things with blockchain is that it is interoperable. In fact, that's one of the reasons there's a lot of interest in using it. Maybe not all the full-on cryptographic things are actually important in science, but the interoperability is super important. Right now, if I need data from this person in somewhere, I need to ask them to download their database, do this, do that. So the collaborative efficiency should definitely increase. Whether on the individual side, I think a lot of the tools that are coming about are fairly easy to use. So I don't think there should be so much difficulty. Perhaps not more than using, say, Dropbox to share data or Slack to share ideas.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think that it's really formalizing a lot of things people are already doing. So as far as sub-analyses are concerned and testing new hypotheses, it's just providing another level of structure. But these are things which social science teams are already doing, but just in an ad hoc way. So by having an entire record, at this point, it's significantly developed to the point where I don't think it's going to require so much new heavy lifting that people aren't doing already, but rather to provide a level of transparency. When it comes out that a paper doesn't replicate those are a whole lot of new costs that are imposed on a scientific team. They have to go back, read their code, which they may not even remember because it's been years, you know, and it can take years to pinpoint where a mistake is, if any. And that's part of the process as well. So by what we're doing is really cutting off a lot of these mistakes that happen along the way, making the decisions people are making more transparent, and making the conclusions that studies want to promote much more trustworthy than is currently the case. For disputes to be settled in a way that it doesn't look like, well, I just don't like this person, that's why I'm trying to prove a study wrong. We're able to separate the personal incentives from what the science actually says.
The one thing that I would say is that, just to add to what Kwek was saying, is that, currently it takes depending on which, the average is still 18 to 20 weeks, right, in order for people to just review your paper. And the higher the quality of the journal, actually it takes much longer. There are many high quality journals, especially in the, let's say, in the marketing and finance areas, for example. It takes 2-3 years in order to even, publish your paper, right? So the velocity with which, scientific research happens is still pretty slow, right? I think what blockchain can really do is give incentive for people to publish small ideas, right, that other people can then build upon, rather than, forcing them to kind of go through and build everything on their own, right? And I think, this type of sharing, I think, will actually speed things up. The fact that, technology-wise, do they need to jump through a couple more hoops in order to send this? I think that is basically maybe overshadowed by, I think, the advantage that they'll get because their data is out there. They can leverage other people's data, and especially in areas which are very important and, where there is a lot of activity happening, I think that this will actually accelerate, the pace of research by quite a bit.
Not to make you name names, but do you think there are some scientific disciplines that are particularly poised for a blockchain intervention, where the replication issue is real? Any top 3? Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think everyone is talking about reproducibility in the behavioral sciences, but let me not pick on them. Let me also mention, I think some of the computational sciences, I think their reproducibility, the actual reproduction of these studies is difficult because people don't have very good version control for their code, parameter settings, things like that. And I think that's an area where blockchain can be quite helpful. So that's another area I think there can be quite a bit of advantage.
Yeah, I think for economics, definitely, it's often difficult to separate economics from politics, and for a lot of disagreements that different meta-analyses have, it's going to be very helpful to be able to pinpoint where the different disagreements actually come from by pinpointing in the code and the analyses where people made different subjective decisions and why. So that for advising policymakers, they can present a unified front that this is what we know about a particular topic, whether it's the minimum wage or it's immigration or video games, whatever the case may be. That because they're often so hard to separate from personal preferences, that this is one area where it's going to be very important for transparency.
I think one area that I would definitely add is artificial intelligence, right? I think there is, not just because I think, about data sharing, but there are a lot of privacy-related concerns which are coming up, right? How do you use the data? Maybe the model, right, I think if you, especially with some of the neural networks and some of the more deep learning type models that are kind of prevalent now, you don't really know which parameters and how they interpret the data. And, things that we don't like, right, like for example, race or gender, et cetera, may be a big part of the model. And you don't really know that by just looking at the model itself, because the model itself is very complicated, right? So we need, I think, more accountability, right, in terms of how the models are being generated, what data do they use? Are they actually taking into account people's privacy concerns when they're using that data, right, in order to achieve their objectives? And none of this is very clear. I think, you talk to, the major companies which you hear in the news, which are associated with artificial intelligence, right? I am not going to name the names, but you know who they are. I think none of them talk about what models they use, what data they use. Are they respecting people's privacy? Are they actually, doing these things ethically, right? Because their model may, most of their model, let's say that there is a model which gives you a mortgage, right? And maybe their fundamental parameter that they use in their model is race, right? Because for whatever reason, it gives them a good prognostication of who is going to, pay the mortgage back. Is that acceptable to society, right? These ethical questions, I think, are very important as well. And I think blockchain can bring the transparency that I think is very needed in the artificial intelligence area.
But don't you think that companies will consider it as something like intellectual property, that they don't want to share this? So
I think, the direction of the discourse, right, is changing already, right? Regulations are already being put in place. But it cannot be done just through regulation. The process needs to be transparent, right? At least some part of the process, which is, maybe independent parties have to go and prove that your model really doesn't discriminate, right? It basically, follows, what society would like to do. I mean, would you want to kind of disadvantage, physically handicapped people, certain races, etc.? These are things that we will obviously react very negatively to. But maybe the models are doing that, under the covers, and we don't know that unless and until we can bring transparency to it. So I'm sure that I think the corporations will push back, but transparency needs to happen, and I think maybe blockchain could be a way to make it happen.
We had a question over here.
Thank you. Nuala Moran from BioWorld. You're going to have this fantastic amount of data, all of which can be checked, but who's going to do the analysis? I mean, does blockchain in and of itself then make it easier to go and interpret what's happened? There's no point in having the audit trail if no one ever looks at it or uses it.
When I think we talk about kind of augmented intelligence and things that help scientists analyze more things, I think that's one approach. And I think information overload broadly is a difficulty in science. At least in my view, blockchain doesn't specifically help with that. I think it's these AI algorithms that really can help. Yeah.
Well, I was going to say that one area which came to mind is with settings where reporting is really important. So an example which people are thinking about is with sexual harassment claims, for example. That in those cases, the timing of the report is often really important and important to know that it will happen at a certain point in time. And that's one context where something like blockchain would be really useful. There are already apps and programs that allow people to anonymously report. The main question there is to do so in a tamper-proof way. And that's one thing that blockchain does really well, that when you report, it's there. So you could have, if you think about someone who is a repeat offender in this area, you could have a sequence of reports on that particular person that authorities would know to focus on, and so on and so forth. As far as doing analyses on data, I think, a lot of what blockchain does is to have the data in a way that makes sense relatively quickly. But you still need people to look at it. But the thing is, they won't be tampering with whatever they find. Even if there are subconscious biases at play, they're not likely to show up in the analysis that they actually do. That if you or anyone else looks at the same data, you should come to the same conclusion, at least approximately, instead of two people finding opposing things from the same data set, which is currently pretty common.
So we still have a job, in other words, to do science.
Exactly.
Okay, we have time for one more question up here in the front row. I should add that we have a briefing tomorrow actually on teaching AI and machine learning to get better answers. It's a theme that has come up here from a couple people.
How you talked about blockchain as a way to address reproducibility and p-hacking and those sorts of things. Do you see in the future that some journals or maybe all journals will start, either encouraging or requiring blockchain to get around those? I mean, to try to address those issues? Or do you think it'll vary field by field? Or do you think this is something that will, simply be voluntary on the side, from the side of the researchers as opposed to the journals?
Yeah, in the behavioral sciences, actually pre-registration is becoming more and more required already. Not necessarily blockchain-based, but I think that's the direction things will go in. And I think what you raise, the question of kind of dissemination, will papers still be the unit of production in science? I think there can actually be fairly large kind of cultural changes that happen in science that are enabled by blockchain. And so maybe it is disaggregated, like Krishna was saying. Kind of data is published as its own unit, analyses are published as their own unit, and so on. And I think that question of how the culture of science and the practice of science change with these technological changes, I think that's actually the most interesting of questions. Will we continue in the same manner we have for the last 400 or 500 years, or will the nature of science itself change? And I think that's an open question, but I think some of these technologies are pushing it in a direction of aggregation in one sense and disaggregation in another sense.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Like from a journal's perspective, when a study fails to replicate, it often affects them reputationally. So a lot of them are open to any kind of solution which could work. As far as individuals and how science is done, I imagine it will take time, for sure, but we don't really have any other, it's not like we have 1,000 ideas at this point. Oftentimes, it's now just a question of how much time will pass before a study fails to replicate. It's more like when instead of if, because methods get better over time. The studies which were cutting edge 10 years ago, now they wouldn't even fly. So I think there's a hunger for creativity. As people are seeing blockchain become useful in other settings, there's a sense that, maybe we can also move in this direction. But it will definitely take time. But we're in the right direction, I think. For the social sciences, we do have ways of pre-registering. The only problem is they're not anywhere near as robust as we would like them to be. People do pre-register studies and they still don't replicate. So this offers another level, another layer of security, which from a journal's perspective, that wants to protect their reputation and have the public put a lot of trust in whatever they publish, they're going to be very interested in solutions like this, I believe.
Great.
I think the only thing that I would say is that, it's not just about positive results. I think people are very interested in putting out positive results, right? Hey, I found this great new nugget of information. My sense is that there will be other types of results that we currently don't encourage because they are not seen as something that would, burnish your reputation. These could be negative results, right? Look, these 3 studies are junk, right? These 4 analyses are junk, right? I'm sure there will be people who can do those things, but these are not seen as all that valuable by scientific community, right? In terms of paper publication. But maybe they do act as like, in some sense, a cleaning agent, right? And I'm sure that there will be people like that coming up as well, right? It's just a question of if we make the playing field level and enable people to basically communicate on a level playing field, it's not that you need to have a big lab and a big reputation in order to put something out, right? If it's important and the right type of information that people find valuable, I think it'll come to the fore automatically, right? I think the transparency that blockchain brings to the table, I don't think we should underestimate.
Great. Thank you so much. That was so interesting with so many useful examples. We really appreciate it. So, okay, we'll now get ready for our 3 o'clock briefing, but if you have any follow-up questions for our speakers, perhaps you can connect with them separately. Thank you so much again.